Today we encounter the Old Testament book of Joshua, a book that we don't hear from very often in modern times. It's in our Bible, but it's a difficult book for modern Christians to relate to, in large part because of all of its violence. When we do hear from the book of Joshua, it's usually not from the violent parts. Instead, it's like today's text, a more wholesome message about choosing God. I'll talk more about choosing God and what that means later. But first, I want to deal with the book of Joshua and the violence and war that we find there, particularly since some Christians point to biblical passages like this as justification for war. To say that war is justified as a means to protect the faith. The invasion of Ukraine is such a war. You may have heard in the news how Russia's leader claimed that his invasion of Ukraine was at least partially justified or needed to defend Russia's Orthodox faith from its enemies, despite the fact that Ukraine is part of the same Christian Orthodox faith as Russia. Yet, Putin gave a speech just Friday night, paraphrasing the Bible, trying to somehow justify this invasion by using the Christian faith. Now, I doubt that this argument is taken seriously outside of Russia, and I can tell you that it's an argument that Ukraine passionately rejects. Yet it does represent a consistent historical theme that instigators of war often use. The argument, the incorrect conclusion that war is biblical, that war is God's will for humankind. The Old Testament contains a lot of stories about battles and wars, with Joshua possibly being the most vivid example. Of course, the book of Joshua is about more than war and conquest. It's also a testimony of faith, the story of a spiritual covenant, a historical record, and more. There's a lot there. But while there's more to the book of Joshua than just war and conquest, the book of Joshua does contain considerable violence, all in the name of God. Given the war in Ukraine and Christianity's checkered past in this area in general, we need to be honest about how our theology can be twisted and used to justify violence. How it's happened in the past and still continues to happen in today's world. While Jesus provides a clear example of nonviolence, the Old Testament is less clear and often seems to approve of violence in the name of God. For those that don't remember where Joshua fits in the Bible, Joshua is ancient. Joshua lived long before Jesus, long before much of the Bible was written. Joshua came right after Moses. It's the first book in the Old Testament after the 5 books that are attributed to Moses. So right after Moses comes Joshua. And remember the biblical timeline, Moses frees the slaves from Egypt and escapes into the wilderness. Once in the wilderness, Moses and his previously enslaved community live a nomadic life for a long time, for 40 years, while looking for a new homeland. They were looking for a place to settle down, a place Moses referred to as the Promised Land. Now, Moses himself doesn't live long enough to make it to the Promised Land, and Joshua, whose today's book was named after, becomes the leader after Moses. After Moses dies, the people, as led by Joshua, arrive at the Promised Land, and they find it is a good land. Plenty of water, good soil, plenty of animals, a Mediterranean Sea full of fish. Beautiful. A wonderful place to settle down. Perfect. There's one little problem, and it's kind of a big problem, by the way. There's already folks living there, a lot of them. People who are not interested in leaving or in becoming part of some new group of people arriving from the wilderness. In the story, in the Bible, God commands Joshua to wipe these people out in a series of battles that can look to modern eyes like genocide. The story of Joshua describes how Joshua's army, under God's command, wiped out every man, woman, child, and animal. Total destruction. This is why we don't hear from the book of Joshua very often. And it's also why this book is sometimes used by critics to discredit the Old Testament. We don't like the idea that God could have commanded such violence. And Joshua is not the only place we find this level of violence either. It's found throughout the Old Testament, but particularly in Joshua and also in the book of Judges. Since such violence is in our Bible, I don't want us to be ignorant or in denial about our history. I don't want anyone to think that it's okay to emulate such violence either. Okay? I want us to know it's there, and I want us to know that it's not okay for us to engage in that type of violence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the book of Joshua is not just about violence. The violence is accompanied by stories of miracles that come about due to God's intervention, and that convince the people that God is really speaking through this warrior named Joshua. For example, you remember the story of the fall of the walls of Jericho. That's found in the book of Joshua. Remember that story? Joshua was commanded by God to conquer the city of Jericho, which was located in the Promised Land. But the city of Jericho was really powerful. It was protected by an excellent wall, huge fortifications, and Joshua's army had no hope of breaching those walls. So it was going to take an act of God to defeat Jericho. Joshua's soldiers weren't going to be able to do it. So God told Joshua and his army to circle the city once a day for 7 days. So clearly they were holding the city under siege at this point. And then on the 7th day, they were to circle the city 7 times. After the 7th time, on the 7th day, the priests in Joshua's army blew their trumpets. And the soldiers yelled loudly, "Ah!" And what happened to the walls? They fell miraculously. Then what happened? Once the walls were down, guess what Joshua did? He killed everyone in the city, except for a few spies that were working for him. So what's going on here? What do we make of these battles and the violence that the book of Joshua describes? For one thing, this is a biblical context. These are not normal human wars. There's this element of direct supernatural involvement, direct guidance that we can miss if we focus on the violence. Also remember that in the biblical worldview, it's not the strongest army that wins, it's the army that has God's blessing. That was the belief in those days. And this all surrounds this overriding plot. The main plot of this story isn't the violence or the miracles. The main plot of this story is the transition of humankind from a belief in multiple gods and many competing gods who constantly were fighting with one another to a new belief, to a belief in there being just one God who represents all life, not just one aspect of life or one group of people. Because it's so different from how we understand the world today, we've had the benefit of history, we've had the example of Jesus Christ. It can be hard for us to grasp how ancient people would have understood this story and this situation. They would have seen it in very different ways than we see it today. The ancient people in Jericho and the folks in the promised land, they all worshiped multiple gods. Each human need had its own god. War had its own god. Hunting had its own god. Farming, fertility, you name it. Every human need had its own god, and those gods were constantly fighting with each other. Since the multiple gods of ancient mythology were always fighting, people in ancient times assumed that war was approved, not just approved, demanded by the gods. That was the example that the gods provided. The story of Joshua's conquest is about establishing the reality that there's only one true God, one source of life, not many. The story of Joshua's complete destruction of all men, women, children, and animals in these lands would have represented evidence that the God of Moses and Joshua was the real God, the only God. That's how ancient people viewed the world. This outcome would have been proof that these other gods were false. Joshua's army conquered the people of Jericho in a way that should not have been humanly possible. Not with all the power and fortification of the city that the city of Jericho had, for example. So it serves as this dramatic, miraculous example of one true God's power over the false pagan gods the people in Jericho and elsewhere in that area of that time worshipped. And the multiple gods that, frankly, most of these enslaved people were accustomed to worshiping too in their time in Egypt. The book of Joshua ends shortly after today's story when Joshua addresses the people and counsels them to choose to serve the true God, not the gods of Egypt or the local gods. This conclusion, this ending, wraps things up neatly. It's part of what some scholars, some readers, to view these wars as allegory, as an external story that is ultimately about an internal battle. As the story wraps up, Joshua reminds the people that although they've been through a lot together since he took over, that none of this is about him. This isn't about Joshua. That their loyalty should not be to Joshua as a commander or as a human leader. Their loyalty, Joshua says, who they choose to serve should be God. The one God, the only God, the true God. The true God that Moses connects with love. Like we often find with biblical stories, there are a number of layers of meaning that are helpful to different people, depending on where we are individually on our spiritual development and in our life. And there are a lot of different messages here. As a literal story, this could be seen as a story about war in the name of God. Symbolically, on a broad historical scale, this story represents a turning point in the spiritual development of humankind. From our understanding of the universe as a competition between many violent gods to experiencing the universe as one single God of peace, of oneness, of connection, and of love. But another way of viewing this story is that people find helpful is seeing this story about our own internal spiritual battle and our own spiritual growth process. We each fight this battle within ourselves as we grow spiritually, if we realize it or not. The gods of wealth, fame, fear, self-centeredness arise in our lives over and over again, and they must be defeated. Sometimes it's a battle we win, but more often, if we are honest with ourselves, often we don't. The world of many gods is the world of selfishness, of my God is better than your God, the world of bigotry, of violence, of exclusion, all of which are still alive and very present in humanity to this day. As we grow spiritually, we live out the story of Joshua fighting for the promised land. We battle false gods such as greed and vanity and selfish desire. But our internal battle is not about violence, it's about diligence. The transition from ancient people believing in many gods to people instead coming to know God as one represents the transition from selfishness to selflessness and the transition from violence to peace. But when even today we look at the world as my God against your God, or my God against the godless, we've taken a step backwards. Even though Joshua is an ancient book, our personal and collective spiritual development has still not reached the point where we're fully heeding Joshua's guidance. Thousands of years later, we're still not there. We consistently choose to serve things that aren't God in our lives. It's like we're still spiritually somewhere in between as a people. Somewhere in between a people of many gods and a people who all share the same God and the same reality. This is where Joshua's final guidance comes in. It's up to each of us to choose who we are going to serve. You got to serve somebody. Joshua's point. Are we going to commit to serving a God who is love, or are we going to commit to serve someone or something else? For example, do we choose wealth for ourselves, me first, at the expense of others? Or do we seek spiritual growth? Do we seek to grow according to the example provided by Jesus Christ? When we actively choose the oneness of God, it facilitates our personal growth, and we move away from trusting in ourselves and trusting in violence to trusting in love and practicing nonviolence. In the context of Jesus Christ, violence is a false god. Can you say that again? Violence is a false god. One that we rely on sometimes more than we rely on God. When we think we can solve our problems with violence, then violence has become our god. Choosing one God is about choosing nonviolence because a single shared God should result in a single shared humanity. Jesus exemplifies this on the cross. Jesus refused to lash out in violence, even when it meant his own life. Why? There's a lot of reasons. Because of his mission, but also because Jesus experienced those who were killing him as still being God's children, as still being God's creation, savable, forgivable, as he died. His view did not change. When we experience reality as one unified whole, as one God, that opens the door to a much wider perspective of life. A perspective that is love and peace and inclusion. A perspective that is in line with the example of Jesus Christ. A perspective of love for all God's creation. Love God, love neighbor, love life. Do you love life? That's what flows from this path towards Jesus Christ. And that perspective is lost in times of war. Let's not kid ourselves. Right now, between Russia and Ukraine, we lose that perspective. When we make choices that don't take others' needs into account, but instead just focus on our own needs, our own selfish desires, our own security, we're serving false gods. Doing God's will is more often than not doing what's best for everyone. And yes, doing what's best even for our enemies. And not just in war between nations. Decisions involving war and peace, violence and nonviolence happen at every level of life from our internal fight against selfishness to our conflicts with our neighbors and our brothers and sisters, our political divisions. Since such decisions are rarely easy or obvious, we use our spiritual practices. This is where our spiritual practices come in to help us discern what is the pathway that love dictates in this moment. Practices such as prayer, meditation, reflection, contemplation, and discussion with each other. These are important. These are vital. And it's not just our intentions that are important. We have to also look at our results. If the decisions we're making lead to more love, to less selfishness, to less violence, if the decisions we make lead to inclusion, to peaceful results, not intentions, results, that is tremendous assurance that we're heading in the right direction. If our decisions lead to violence, to exclusion, to war, we might be on the path of Joshua, but we are not on the path of Jesus Christ. Russia's leader is trying to use faith and religion to justify his invasion, just like Joshua did. But the Russian leader is not Joshua. Unlike Joshua, there is no sign, no spiritual basis for Russia's claim that I can see. You may see things differently, I don't know. And the Russian people, just like us in the U.S. and the people in Ukraine, should know better because we have had the benefit of knowing about Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. The largest religion in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church. Not to suggest that Russia is the only country who's ever used a questionable biblical approach. Yes, Russia has one church, and that's beautiful. We have many. Maybe they get that right. But when it comes to justifying war, no. And we've done it too. The U.S. has also engaged in questionable wars. The U.S. has sometimes followed Joshua rather than Jesus. But truly, shouldn't we all know better by now? We have the whole Bible. We have the example of Jesus. Over and over again, we're faced with choices, big and small, as individuals, as a community, as a church, as a nation. Who are we going to serve? Who? Who are you going to serve? Will we choose the false gods of human power and greed, of might and money, of oil and ego? Or will we choose to serve the Lord? To love one another with Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, as our example.